Afternoon, everyone. So I am Catherine Dardstad with Latent Design. I know people are starting to filter in this afternoon. So thank you for joining us over your lunch or afternoon break. I'll give it a couple minutes for people to slowly start filtering in, and then I'll introduce myself and then hand it over to Gary to introduce himself. And then we'll have short introductions about our work, and then get a little bit into Q&A, and then you'll be on your way. So thank you, and give us another minute.
Thanks, Catherine.
Alors, bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining the CSLA Congress. And thank you, Catherine, for giving us a preview of what we're going to be hearing today. We're just going to let people log in. I'll do some brief housekeeping and a land acknowledgement, and then we'll hand it over to our moderators, Reina and Pavishka. And we have an exciting session for you today. Alors, bienvenue tout le monde à la séance de webinaire de l'APC. Alors, on va débuter en quelques instants. On va laisser les gens s'inscrire et on va commencer très bientôt. Alors, quelques minutes et on débute la séance. And to those who are just logging in, we're just going to hold for a minute or two while people join the session, and then we'll get started. Alors, bonjour encore tout le monde. On va attendre quelques instants que les gens s'inscrivent et on va commencer très bientôt.
I will not be speaking in French. I'm going to make that announcement now.
Yeah, j'oublie mon français, sorry.
Don't worry, I won't be either. We just had a question asking to turn on the subtitles. Is that feasible?
We'll check with Catherine, who should be able to give us some technical assistance. And we're just logging in a few more people, and we'll get started just in a minute. All right, I see that we have pretty much everybody logged in for today. So we are going to get started. So hello, everybody. Bonjour. My name is Michelle Legault, and I'm the Executive Director of the CSLA. I want to welcome you all. Bienvenue tout le monde. Mon nom est Michelle Legault et je suis la Directrice Générale de l'APC. We'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. So I would ask you to place your feet on the ground and breathe the air at your location. We acknowledge that we're gathering today from coast to coast to coast on the lands of First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people and their government. And we acknowledge that the head office of the CSLA is in unceded Algonquin and Anishinaabe territory. Alors, nous aimerions commencer par une reconnaissance des terres. Veuillez poser vos pieds sur le sol et respirer l'air à votre emplacement. Nous reconnaissons que nous nous réunissons aujourd'hui d'un océan à l'autre sur les terres des Premières Nations, des Inuits et des Métis et de leur gouvernement. Nous reconnaissons que le siège social de l'APC se trouve dans le territoire non cédé des Algonquins et des Anishinaabe. Thank you, everybody. So welcome to the newest edition of the CSLA's webinar series. We're using a webinar format for today's sessions, which means that only the speaker's video is visible. You can submit your questions or comments by Q&A or by chat. And note that this event is being recorded. Alors, un petit rappel que nous utilisons un format webinaire pour la séance d'aujourd'hui, ce qui signifie que seule la vidéo des intervenants est visible. Vous pouvez soumettre vos questions ou commentaires par chat ou par le bouton QR, questions et réponses. Et notez que l'événement est enregistré. Today, we welcome speakers who will be discussing how principles of co-design can be applied in landscape architecture practice. And I will now turn it over to our moderators to present our speakers. Alors aujourd'hui, nous accueillons 4 intervenants qui discuteront de la manière dont les principes de la co-conception peuvent être appliqués dans la profession de l'architecture de paysage. Et je laisse la parole à nos modérateurs qui vont présenter. So Tavishka and Reina, please, and Mercedes, take it away. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Michelle, and thank you everybody for joining us today. My name is Reina, and on behalf of Tavishka and I, we are the co-founders of Common Space Coalition, which is a small nonprofit that advocates for a more equitable landscape architecture practice. Over the past year, we engaged in a research project funded by the Landscape Architecture Canadian Foundation called Co-Design Now. So to set the context for our project and our conversation today, racially and culturally diverse communities are the heart, soul, and core of our cities. They've laid the foundations that make our cities culturally rich, creating an eclectic and community experience at the urban scale. Yet, many of these communities are often let out of the city building process due to a number of factors: prioritization of market rate condos, inaccessible public consultations, and unchallenged policy frameworks. This inequity prevails. Co-Design Now, our project, advocates for city builders, in our case, landscape architects, to engage with and invest in community planning, creating a more inclusive professional practice that does not displace communities. The core work of our project resulted in a year of partnership with a local community organization to explore how we could exactly engage in this kind of co-design process. So we partnered with Parkdale People's Economy, a group of 30 community-based organizations and hundreds of community members collaborating to build decent work, shared wealth, and equitable development in the vibrant, rapidly gentrifying Parkdale neighborhood in Toronto's West End. We joined their planning committee with a group of diverse community members meeting once a month to collaborate and participate in a year-long community planning process. Together, we held 4 online community mapping workshops using an interactive mapping tool online called Social Pinpoint. With these workshops, we really prioritize understanding people's experiences of belonging and their visions for well-being in the neighborhood through a mapping and storytelling process. The impacts of development and displacement were also critical themes. Through this project and this webinar today, we have learned and will learn from other industry leaders ways in which city building professionals can prioritize and advocate for community, relationships, and cultural character within our professional practice. So I'm going to pass it off to our community partner, Mercedes, who's at Parkdale People's Economy, to talk a little bit more about the community planning process. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reina. And as mentioned, I'm here on behalf of the Parkdale People's Economy, which is a network of community-based organizations and hundreds of community members in Parkdale. And our work is interested in understanding how community planning can impact neighborhood change. And a core principle we operate around is recognizing that change itself is a constant. It's something that in many ways is inevitable, but that the way that a neighborhood changes is actually something that can be altered. And we believe that through an organized community focused on shared visions and values, we can actually imagine more equitable futures in our cities. Parkdale People's Economy created a participatory plan in 2016, and we're currently creating a renewed plan based on our current context. And especially with the challenges that we face due to COVID-19 and attempting to do community-based engagement during this time, the online mapping tool that was created by Co-Design Now has supported us with engaging community members across the neighborhood to understand their visions for economic, racial, and climate justice in Parkdale. The mapping tool allowed us to analyze the impacts of developments in the neighborhood while also building a power analysis of community needs, assets, and visions for the neighborhood. We complemented our online workshops with translated sessions and in-person engagement to reach community members who might not often be engaged through traditional consultation settings. And this work will ultimately be informing the final stage of our planning, visions to actions, and ultimately leading to creating a brand new plan for the Parkdale community. So with that said, I'm going to pass it back to the Co-Design team, and thank you so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Mercedes, for outlining all the amazing things that Parkdale People's Economy has done and will continue to do. It is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers today. They are Gary Pooney and Catherine Dardstad. So Catherine is the founder of Latent Design, a progressive architecture and urbanism firm, leveraging civic innovation and social impact to design more equitable spaces and systems. She's based in Chicago, and since founding her practice in 2010, Catherine and her firm have prototyped new urban design systems to advance urban agriculture. They have supported small businesses through Boombox, created spaces for youth makers, advanced building innovation through Blankbox, and created public space frameworks through Design Trust Chicago. She and the firm have been published, exhibited, and featured widely, and she has previously taught at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and Northwestern University. It is also my pleasure to introduce Gary Pooney, who in his role as president at Pooney Group, Gary drives the firm's growth and guides major client projects as the strategic lead. With over 20 years of planning-related experience in Vancouver, he has spearheaded some of the country's most significant projects through Metro Vancouver, Vancouver Island, the Sea to Sky Corridor, Alberta, and Ontario. Often recognized as a man behind the Lower Mainland's most complex projects, he has been listed as a changemaker and power player shaping our world in Vancouver Magazine's 2022 Power 50 list. Gary is also a member of the Canadian Institute of Planners. So welcome, Catherine and Gary. I will hand the mic over to Catherine, who will now speak to some of her work.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. You heard from me earlier. I took a little bit of Michelle's job and did a mini introduction, but I'll do this for myself because I know what I'm supposed to do right now, but we're gonna figure out how this is gonna look good on the screen. So I can make sure everything looks good for you. So give me 1 second to pull this up. All right, everyone. So as mentioned, my name is Catherine Dardstad. I'm the founder of Latent Design. We're based in Chicago, and the firm is 12 years old right now. So we're an architecture, we kind of think of ourselves as architects plus. So when we look at our staff that we have architects, planners, landscape architects, affiliated and really close professionals and collaborators, depending on the types of projects that we're working on. And I founded Latent Design back in 2010 with this idea of exploring architecture as small or as large as the context allows. And throughout the years, if you could tell just even by the start of the presentation, and apologies for the phone in the background, but you could tell, I really love color. I love what color can do to spaces. I like also how it could bring people together and drop down barriers, and how it can transform, even in the most temporary sense, our corridors, our streets, our neighborhoods, and the way that we communicate with one another. And with that, as there's been this thread of placemaking projects and this kind of small scale of work throughout the last 10 years of our firm, from looking at installing and transforming corridors for placemaking, gathering, seating, planting, markets that could exist on public plazas. This, as was mentioned, is how the Boombox project is even the largest of the small scale projects that we look at. It's been over the past decade plus an opportunity to also think about what placemaking means. How do you take it beyond those triple Ps of paint, plants, and plywood that governed most placemaking projects, and start to turn it into an ecosystem of sustainable systems, policy, neighborhoods, legislation that creates equitable spaces and systems? Because that's why all of us are here. That's what we're here listening to. That's what we're here, that's what we work towards. But it has to take those initial provocations that we have through these small projects and turn them into something more, turn them into a better system of how we can support neighborhoods, or even through this example of the Boombox project, which was micro retail on public plazas. How do we turn that into spaces for small businesses and artists to thrive? How do we turn that into a space where people who get blocked out of our existing systems, how do they get a chance to thrive and grow? And that has kind of moved our firm over the past 10 years. These projects that are small projects and seem, sometimes get dismissed. They get to turn into larger ones, and they get to transform and grow even further. About 5 years ago, we started to work with the Mayo Clinic up in Rochester, Minnesota, around redesigning both their public plaza downtown in downtown Mayo, and now we're working with them across redesigning all of their public spaces and corridors, as that plaza connects to the river and then to a park to a park. What's interesting about this project, and what's interesting about this idea of working with a entity and a city that is a place where people go from across the globe when they're sick. The project brief started from a very simple premise of, what if a doctor at the Mayo gave a patient a prescription to take a walk? What would that walk look like? And I think that's a beautiful statement to think about, how a city decided to invest billions of dollars into their public spaces, their buildings, and their downtown, which is, a very atypical situation. But it brought up a question that we should always ask everyone and every project. What if we want to take a walk? What does that neighborhood and what does that block look like? Where can I sit? Where is there shade? Where is there a place to gather? Or where is there a place to be alone? And that opportunity started to guide, a lot of our work then moving forward, where this project for Heart of the City is opening next week. We're very excited about it. And we get to experience all of those very seemingly simple questions of where to sit, what does my walk look like, where is shade, all finally come together. And when we really analyze our cities and spaces, sometimes we realize that those spaces don't exist. And we have to take a really critical look at it, the same way that we had at this project. Is the challenge with this project in Rochester was that there were plenty of places to sit, you just had to pay for them. You had to pay for the coffee, you had to pay for the lunch, you had to, pay to go into a building. So where was the publicness of public space? And then if it doesn't exist, how do we start to bring it back through our practices and our work? Of course, we love to be able to work at a variety of different scales. And so we've worked thinking about, art and placemaking within projects across the Midwest as well, working with Theaster Gates for an Art House Gary project in Gary, Indiana. And I had a video, but I'll show it later maybe. But if you haven't noticed, it's not only color, but it's about, if we can do it in neon, we would love to. And we want to always continue to think about a way that space and place can create ideas or opportunities as large or as small as the context allows. And that's, what we do within latent design. It's about making the invisible visible. And the tool we use is design to make that happen. And so thank you. And I will hand it over to Gary to share a little bit more with you.
Thanks, Catherine. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
All right. I'm just going to pull up my presentation. And can you see this?
Yes, we can see it.
You've got it. All right, great. I'm going to take a much more sort of philosophical, sociological approach to change. So for those urban planners and demographers, they'll be familiar about how we look at history and how, as a species, we accept change and some of the things that we go through from an urban perspective. So I'm going to take a step back from way back, big picture stuff from Catherine's presentation, and talk more from a planner's perspective around change. So a little bit about our company. We're an urban planning firm. And sometimes we're brought in as marriage counselors for developers. When developers and a municipality aren't getting along, we intervene. When you have the public and a developer are not getting along, we come in and help out as well. So a good portion of our work is around public consultation and public engagement and trying to find this sweet spot between neighborhoods, municipalities, councils, and developers, and positioning projects in the best possible light to be approved. We are also planning nerds. We do policy work, planning work, detailed in the trenches, typical urban plans. And sometimes we come in as the Navy SEALs of the real estate and development industry and inherit a really difficult situation, try to secure a beachhead, send in 6 of our staff, lose 2 people, 4 people make it back, and then on to another project. Mostly what we are is agents of change. So everyone here that works within our industry, whether you're an architect, landscape architect, planner, developer, in this industry, you have to remember that there is a constant evolution and change that is being communicated. If you look at our region in Vancouver, that's where we are based. There is an immense amount of history that has gone into our downtown peninsula in a relatively short period of time in the history of this continent over the last 100 years. And every urban center this past century has gone through similar change. Take a look at how we've lived as a human species over the centuries, and there has been incredible change in the way that we live, and it is still coming. What I find now is that I in doing a lot of thinking coming out of this pandemic and in a tech revolution, that we're at this watershed moment, like a real crossroads in terms of urban change and how we manage it. This is, in my mind, is a real critical point for the history of our cities, right? The pages that we are writing now. So the 3 things that we've been watching over is global urbanization and the urban tensions that come from that urbanization. 2/3 of the world's population lives in cities now, and it will be over 70% by probably 75% by 2050. This current industrial revolution that we're in, that's largely based on tech and the strength of the millennial population. I'll talk about that. And the 3rd thing is post-pandemic behavioral changes. Those are the 3 things when it comes to the change in our cities and our neighborhoods that we watch, from big picture drilling down into local. The other thing to keep in mind is behavioral economics. And Michael Lewis had written about this, as have many other people. In short, it's just that the tendency of us, when you look at behavioral economics, is not to act rationally. So what do I mean from that? It's around spending habits. It is around philosophical thinking around housing. It drives everything in most decisions that we make that should seem rational but are not. So from a industry perspective, what I try to keep in mind is that there aren't always rational solutions to these urban issues. Okay. And so some of us that are either dealing with developers or municipalities or neighborhoods sometimes feel that someone isn't listening to us, or the other side feels that you're just standing in the way of my project. And there's a real communication breakdown when it comes to that. And sometimes rational thinking goes out the window with the types of things that a neighborhood might need, and from what might be forced or put onto a certain neighborhood. So really our role comes down to managing this change, right? Between urban planning and real estate development, between a neighborhood and a developer, between a municipality and the people that live in an affected area. It is about managing change. So how we go about, or why do we have to do that? You do have to remember, particularly people on the private industry side, that public input is mandatory as a part of the municipal or government decision-making. Yes, there's cities, plans and policies. Yes, there's technical requirements, and there's other objectives that a proponent might have, but public input is one of those 4 main pillars that needs to be considered. That is how we operate for the most part, in our North American municipal economies. The main conflict, the root of this, what we find is around three things. It's the nature of a change in a neighborhood, the intensity of the change, and the main thing is the rapidness of it. So if there's major, sudden, unexpected change that comes to a community or into a neighborhood, that's where there's a feeling of it being irreversible and a conflict that arises from that. I'm going to quickly switch to the pandemic. Let's look back in history, because I like taking a look into the past to see where we might be headed in the future. 1920, our pandemic then, 50 million died. 50 million people worldwide, 500 million people, 500 million people were infected. We're also rebuilding our globe, particularly Europe, after World War I. And then out of that hardship came a period of time where we like to refer to as the Roaring 20s, right? It was the rebirth of swing dancing, the birth of jazz music, and new norms around fashion and culture. And there was a brief moment in time, a very brief moment in time, where men learned how to dress and then quickly forgot about it. And so, but it also ushered in a cultural civil war, right, between city dwellers and small town people. And so this jubilation of the Roaring 20s brought a lot of social urban conflict, a lot of things that we are also seeing today, a lot of urban conflict. So layer into that this high-tech revolution that we are going through and the post-pandemic behavioral changes, more than just being clean and social distancing. And it is more than just those of you who bought a Peloton or may have read a book or bought a pet or a bread maker. Behavioral changes when it comes to shopping and the use of tech. A session like this, right, that rarely happened as an engagement and teaching session. Being able to work from home and the mobility that we have. So you bring in a pandemic, you bring in high-tech change and a massively growing urban population. There is going to be sudden, rapid change. People leading that change are going to be millennials, the much maligned millennials. I know my generation of Gen Xers like to poke fun at millennials, but in North America, they already outnumber probably around 25 million now, outnumber boomers. And already by 2017 have more spending power than any other age group. So what we try to do is bring in a big picture perspective when it means change in a certain neighborhood and understanding that context, right? The growth in our cities is a fact. It's happening quickly. It's happening in a tech environment. There's also a new resurgence of culture and art and social presence that neighborhoods and communities want to keep. Millennials are a huge factor, and whatever your engagement strategy is in the public, it just needs to be relevant. Okay, so again, change can be one of our greatest capacities, but also one of the greatest stresses that we can go through. Very quickly, some of the things that we do traditionally, we have open houses, meetings with stakeholders, we use traditional media, and have really moved into virtual meetings. Sometimes, like in a high-rise project that was going into a single-family neighborhood, we had to get into door knocking to let everybody know what was happening. Very easy way to connect with the public and to establish an honest relationship. When we have a redevelopment of a shopping mall, we actually set something up in the center. You know, if you are going to just have one open house for a development project in a neighborhood, in a church basement with U-shaped boards and make it feel like a funeral, it's going to appear like a funeral and the death of the neighborhood. So there has to be better ways to engage people, particularly those who are going to be impacted by the change. There's a lot of digital engagement that we had done in the first year of the pandemic. We had a number of websites, a lot of engagement. And within 8 months had 300,000 people that we had reached through social on 41 online events. That's just in 2019. Here's an example of some of the tools that we use with our online engagement. You have to get out to where the people are. That's what we find. This whole thing of hiding when it comes to real estate and development planning work doesn't really work. And who knows what the future holds for public engagement, but we do feel that tech is going to have a big role. Okay, so just in summary, when we're going in and working in a neighborhood, we know that there's going to be expected tensions in the urban centers. Remember, if you're going into a neighborhood with great rapid change, that you are going to need some time to communicate that. Finding a way to get millennials engaged in our process. And we find that tech works because it won't come out to 2 meetings, and just being much more relevant and accessible from a proponent side. Okay, so that's just some big picture thinking when it comes to the work that we've been doing across Canada that we try to bring into our neighborhoods.
Thank you so much, Gary, for sharing that. It's really interesting to hear about issues around engagement and design from a big picture perspective. And so you spoke to more technology and changing demographics and the changing habits of engagement. And Catherine, you spoke to more site-specific placemaking. And seeing as you both are coming from, in your perspectives are coming from big picture and very site-specific, I wanted to ask, what are some lessons that you've learned or experiences that you've had engaging in communities that have really surprised you and have really challenged your way of thinking or your traditional training as a planner and architect in your career journey?
I could kick that one off with a recent one that we're working through right now in Des Moines in Iowa, where the most public engagements sometimes what I've been surprised with is with this community that we worked with is they're very comfortable saying the quiet part out loud. And it started with, are we going to have any real power if we say anything on this project? Yes or no? And if it's a no, we're not engaging. If it's a yes, then we are. And I think it was very helpful for me as the engagement consultant and design consultant on the project, because that's kind of like the thing behind the scenes we try and do with our clients, because sometimes you have to also educate them to say like, hey, if we're going to be asking opinions about place, space, you have to actually listen to them, and it can't be performative or part of what you feel is how you document an equitable process. We need to actually make it an equitable decision-making process too. So that was helpful. And it made a lot of tension, right? Of course, but it actually got us to the place in a project where when we say we're co-designing with the community, at the end, everyone felt like they were truly heard, and it was a project that was co-designed with them. And that ultimately it did challenge even the city to have to change some of their processes. And that wouldn't have happened if the community members and leadership weren't really upfront. And it was very enlightening just to see how respectful but bold they were with it. And saying, we could have these meetings, but let's set the tone on how we engage in these meetings, what happens, and what transparency really means. And then what are our tasks? Because if you treat everyone with respect and you have a transparent share of information, then you could go through community meetings and you could get some real serious tasks and decisions done that inform the project.
Mm-hmm. And just quickly, so can you speak to the importance of the project outcome? So it sounds like in this project that the community really was able to speak their mind, and they were very they really wanted to be involved in the project, and you engage in a co-design process. Can you speak specifically to some of the positive project outcomes of having that involvement in that particular project?
Yeah, for that one, since it was a community center project, it was around what programming elements are going into a building. It even started with, are they renovating an existing building or building a new one? So these are big pieces. It's not only like what room and how big. It was like, are we here and is this our pathway, or are we over there? And what came out of that was really helpful, it was like, first, everyone wants to know this. First, it was more money. So in the end, the project budget that we started with ended up getting $3 more million because it allowed for more buy-in from different levels of the city then. So for, say like, okay, we have not only a department engaged, but now we have a full city council engaged, and now we have the mayor engaged. So more money for a project, and $3 million isn't, a small amount to add to a community center project to allow it to go from 12 to $15 million from that. It was kind of clarity and commitment to the program elements. One of the major program elements for decision making was pool or no pool, right? Because the current building had a pool, but it was closed during COVID and it will never reopen again because it just requires too much repair. And so the community, the big decision point was pool or no pool. Everyone knows in a new building, pools are very expensive. They're expensive to maintain. That is why the current one isn't reopening. But the community wasn't going to come to the table unless you're replacing existing amenities one-to-one. And it was a common refrain that we heard that is a phrase that I'll remember from the community. They said, we don't want addition through subtraction. So we don't want to gain a new construction building, ensure it's state of the art. It might be LEED, it might be all of these other things that are deemed important to a different community, but we don't want to lose the thing that we need. We need the same amenities. We need the pool, we need the running track, we need these spaces because that's how we teach our kids to swim. It's not like about just aerobics for elderly people, our seniors. It's about, you know, teaching kids how to swim, how to gather, how to have a safe space, right? And those are some of the direct outcomes that came from that process. More money, greater commitment, and an understanding that now you have champions at every level of the project that need to approve a project that has public funds. It's not about just the core project manager saying like, yep, I'm with you, I believe you, but it had to go all the way up and down that policy and political chain.
Thank you for sharing. Gary, what are some lessons you've learned or experiences you've had that have surprised you?
Good question. Surprises. So there's three that come to mind. Actually, first of all, before I get into that, Catherine, I love the use of your color in the work that you do. And when we talk about being relevant to, to a specific context, we just shy away from things having a bit of a personality. And so there's just little things that you can do in a project like the use of color that just brings some life to it. And just makes things feel better. And it's a great way to actually engage people in micro level decisions, to have some of their input, particularly when it comes into public spaces. So I just want to say that, coming from a guy who wears bow ties and is not shy about color. So the surprises, 2 examples in Toronto and 1 in Calgary. The Honest Ads redevelopment that we worked on, Mirvish Village, knowing that the magnitude of change was going to be great, and that we had to build a working relationship with a very active neighborhood, we engaged with them very early. And so for the most part, we didn't agree on everything, but for the most part, it was really good. And what we found was, it wasn't so much the fact that there was going to be this big discount store that was going to be removed. It was the social interaction that came with it, where you would bump into people. So if we had come in with a rezoning application to put in a Walmart in that location, and which was really what Honest Ads was, with bright lights and a bit of personality, but largely as the land use, that's what it was, it would never have been accepted. But the social part of it was something that we understood. We said, okay, you know what, we will create a public market, because I think that's what people are craving, and we've got the space to do this. So that's number 1. Number 2 was the fine grain of the retail, that they wanted an incredible variety of retail, and that they just didn't want large commercial tenants coming in. So then we made a maximum size for the retail units. It didn't make a difference to us, but then it really fit into the neighborhood. And then the tenure was something that we were going back and forth on. Is it condo? Is it rental? Because we could probably do either. And we found that there's great appetite for rental housing, and we went with rental. So 1,000 rental units. So working relationship on a massive project like that, given the rapidness of the change that was going to come to the neighborhood, it had to be a very slow approach. And it was over 2.5 years, I believe, is that's how long it took us. So that was a pleasant surprise. We're not surprised when with a development project that there's people that just show up to just really don't want any change in a neighborhood at all. We're not surprised by that. Those are entrenched positions. You have a development industry that wants to move something forward, or a city hall, and there's a group of people that does not. But there is a huge group of people that are that want to be engaged. So
Actually,
that's
I'd like to follow up on what you just
Yeah.
said. I'm curious, in other than the people that are generally opposed to change in the neighborhood, what other challenges exist to your process? Because both you and Catherine work in these ways that involve people from the very beginning. And that, as Catherine said, that creates buy-in, that creates more engagement, that creates more resilience in the project because people are committed to it in the long term. But what challenges exist to your process? So things like zoning or bylaws, government regulations, maybe clients being resistant to having people involved in the beginning. Have you ever had to convince a client to get on board?
or all of the above.
Or all of the above? Yeah.
All of the above. It really you have for the most part, you have a development industry that is perceived as 1%ers. And there is great mistrust with most municipalities. The most mistrust that I've seen has been in the Toronto area, to be honest with you. And I will say this, it's because having done some work there over the last 8-9 years, public engagement has not traditionally been done well. It is, I'm going to call out the industry. Let's do as little as possible. Let's lobby the ward councillors. We'll cut a deal and try and get a residents association on board. And if we don't, then we just prepare for a provincial appeal. And it's not, man, like it doesn't work. Like something like that doesn't work. You can plan for some of that, some hostility, but why start off with that?
But
That's the part I understand.
How can city building professionals like architects, planners, and landscape architects sort of overcome, and Catherine, you spoke to this a little bit before, how can we overcome these systematic hurdles to sort of drive this change in our own professions? Like what, or how can we move forward knowing these things?
Yeah, it's a tough question because most of our projects are public or community based. Like even the large ones are part of some sort of public or public funding process, which then dictates a public engagement process, which we could push forward. So I think if I look back at our portfolio of work, we probably have had 2 large scale developer clients, and they were more mission driven. So we don't face that same issue where we have to convince them that they need engagement. Where we face the issue is how deep and how much we want to push them on what that actually means. So it really goes into the decision making on what happens on a project. Where we were, and so we look at that a couple different ways. One way where we have been successful is, does it need to be a large scale public engagement process? No, it doesn't. It could be a more directive and intense and more intentional process with a core community group or a partner, and that has been successful. So how do you take something that seems maybe at first what they could be afraid of is it's too wide, too broad, could be too unwieldy, could have too many left field questions, right? They can't control it, right? Because public engagement is sometimes an uncontrollable comment period, which is good and can be, frightening at the same time. So how do we actually narrow that down into a series of people and opinions that can make influence and power? So let's do that. And then the other realm is, well, if it doesn't need the process or they're not required to do it, they're not going to do it. But how do we inform what our public facing piece is within a project? Okay, so we're working on a development, and there are affordable housing units in it, but there's no mandate because it's all privately funded to have any public engagement process. So our influence can be around how do we push them to keep affordable housing units on site versus trying to put it off site or trying to pay into an affordable housing fund within the city, because you pay less than it costs to build the unit. So that's a great deal for a developer. It's a shitty deal for the city, right? Because you don't have enough money to actually build the unit that you're offsetting. And we need more affordable housing in the neighborhood that the development is in versus offsite somewhere else. So those are 2 different ways that we've approached kind of integrating public opinion and comments. One is through narrowing and being more intentional in the engagement groups and audiences that we're working with. And then the other is acting as as the public and bringing the opinion in through our role as a professional, which does carry weight and power with it to try and influence a project.
Thanks
I don't
for
think
that.
there's a systemic fix. I think there's going to be people, because if you, a systemic fix is, there's Catherine's group, and they're going to succeed, and there's going to be ones that don't, and they will not succeed. With the way that information is spread through technology very quickly, hiding behind a project and trying to sneak something through, it doesn't work anymore. It's a broken model. So I think that, but your question is a good one about how to overcome it. And for me, I think the letting as many people know about change that's coming into a neighborhood as possible, and engaging everybody. And one more quick example. You said about one of the surprises that we've had. The biggest surprise we had was when we held a children's open house for a new playground we were designing. And we thought, here's something different. Let's actually invite a bunch of kids out. We had 200 families show up. We had more people show up to that event than the overall open house for the development project. And then we collected ideas from kids. We took ones that we thought worked and let them know that their thoughts were being incorporated into a playground that they were going to be using. So, and what came out of that was a lot of fun. We got a great playground and built a great working relationship with the neighborhood. So these barriers were broken down, and it just takes a little bit of trust, and it's how you conduct yourself. It's the same as saying, what's the secret in a relationship? You can't point to one thing, but it really comes down to trust and establishing some good principles, a good foundation. That's where I think it starts. So probably not a systemic fix, but you'll have some that do it well and they will succeed, and others will not. And it just has not been done well, in my opinion, over the last decade in the Greater Toronto area.
Something that that's a perfect segue to a question I have for you both. Something we learned in our process working with Parkdale People's Economy and working with a lower income and a very diverse neighborhood was that the kinds of questions and learning about their experience, which is very different from designing a condo, where you'll have an amenity space and maybe you need a pool or some benches or a planter and trees, and you're meeting a set of requirements. But something we learned, we're asking more experiential questions about what their day-to-day living is like, what their sense of belonging is like, where do they want to see their neighborhood going, what are these definitions of equity and wealth, and how can that be shared amongst the community? I'm curious what kind of questions both of you engage with in the communities that you work with, and how is it different from municipal, like Toronto's municipal public consultation questions are basically just, this is what the building is going to be, this is how it's going to look, and this is the road that's going to go next to it, and that's basically it. Like you mentioned earlier, Gary, it's done very poorly, and it's not really about listening to a community at all. So what kind of questions, or how do you go about engaging with the community that might not be yours?
Well, that relationship that you described is just transactional, right? It's not building a relationship. So we like to, because we're new coming into a neighborhood, there's always some reconnaissance that we want to do, and it goes beyond just having a meeting with the residents association. I love taking community polls before you undertake a project, just to understand what the biggest issues are in that neighborhood. For example, what are your three biggest priorities? What are your three biggest issues? And then from that, you start drilling down into priorities and the things that are important in that neighborhood. I would say in Parkdale, just knowing from my aunt who lives there and my cousin who grew up there, that their concern would be about tenure and accessibility, and over time, would they still be able to live here with like-minded people, and just being concerned about gentrification And it's not about being socially active. It is about a sense of belonging in their own neighborhood. So there is a place for social well-being and gentrification. The two can exist together. Economic development and social can exist together. So the questions that we asked ourselves is trying to find that balance, and what benefit comes to a neighborhood as a result of the project that we're bringing forward. That's really the basic question. Get an understanding of who we're getting into a relationship with, and number two, there has to be some benefit to this neighborhood in order to bring them along from a macro level. I'm sure Catherine has ideas like at a micro level in terms of design, which is way beyond my pay grade, about how to fix those things.
Mhm.
But that's probably the experience of the neighborhood is something they would want to continue with, I'd imagine, Catherine.
Yeah, I think the other piece to add to that is that layer of kind of experience and emotional cartography that we have on projects and places. I think that's very important to try and elicit from the conversations. I know it's an intangible qualitative item, but it's important that that gets heard. And then I think the report at the end is the most powerful place to put it, because that's where, as Gary was mentioning, sure, these processes, when you look at it from a project or a governmental process, are completely transactional, but where that weight carries in terms of how do we still want to feel, how do we still want to communicate, how do we still want to see authority or power represented, or our power represented in the neighborhood. It exists in the report. I know everyone laments that nobody reads the report, but people really do. And if there's something written that becomes part of a city document and you could point to it later on, that was important. That could be important to say, like, hey, the community felt that this would be their goals on a project, or their priorities that they would want to see moving forward, or how they view ability, because that would pull that allows you as the designer, the planner, the landscape architect to use your professional authority and power in a way that benefits the larger community.
Thank you so much, Catherine. We have an audience question. We've got about 7 minutes left, so we'll switch over. And Gary, you answered in the chat, but for everyone else, I'll just read it out loud. Do you have any specific strategies that you have found to be effective for quantifying the value that your work brings to projects and communities?
No
Gary.
specific strategy. Yeah, so just typed in no specific strategy. Every situation is different. It's the end result, really, about the level of acceptance that we've ultimately received. And the less people that show up at a public hearing that are opposed to what we're doing, you've generally done a pretty good job. It takes a lot to show up at one of those public meetings to show you're upset about something. So nothing specific, just turn down the level of hate.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty easy recipe.
I know, Catherine, you spoke to an expanded project budget as a result of public support for projects.
Yeah, so what we've been doing and what we started tracking, specifically with the Mayo Clinic project that I mentioned, was how much extra was the co-design process, or having community stewards, or bringing in artists, all this stuff that when we say it, people are like, that sounds expensive, but it came down to, it was less than 1% extra of the total project budget. So if you're going to take 1% of your project budget and dedicate it to this type of engagement process, now we could start to quantify it in a way that it seems that it can be much more easily integrated, because you always have to get over that hurdle of this is extra, and you're like, no, it's integrated, it's important, and it's long term. Now we show what that looks like. So you can't just, we had to follow a project and we had to pull it all the way through to see how prototyping objects in a one-to-one scale in a public space had value, because we would have designed the wrong thing if we didn't put something out there for people to comment on. And designing the wrong thing is worse than spending, the extra $5,000 to make a temporary intervention to get comments on it, right? So, that's what we started to track, and that's what we use as part of our part of our motivation to clients to carry it on. So we have real project examples, and we also have very real project examples from the same Mayo project where we prototyped something and people hated it. It's like, great, even better, you hated it, like, you know, made memes about it on Facebook, and I was like, great, that's awesome. They like, we totally won't use that material. I get it, I heard it, but it doesn't mean that the bench still shouldn't go. Like, benches should go here, we just hate the material and the design. It's like, okay, cool. You know, and then when we move forward and presented the next round, then it was like, okay, we like this, and you know, then it becomes the pathway to make a better public space.
Yeah, I think memes are like the ultimate cultural critique now.
Yeah.
So we have another question. So sometimes cities are concerned about integrating the co-design process, as the city already has a direction that has been studied, as we've discussed earlier, is very systematic way of doing things. And perhaps co-design is seen as something that might complicate the project process. How have you advocated to implement co-design process in your work? I know you spoke to this a little bit earlier, but maybe examples or points.
For us, you're absolutely right that sometimes, you know, cities have and municipal partners or even private partners have a direction they want to go with this project, and, you know, they're open to hear opinions, but still going to end up being the way that they thought of it. That was definitely the Des Moines project. My very first meeting with the client as the city, you know, the director of the department came in and said, hey, we want to have this public engagement process, but my vision for my department for this new facility is going to have X, Y, and Z and no pool. And I didn't even need to have one community meeting. I just looked at all the previous information, like the reconnaissance that Gary talked about. We studied all of that. And we knew that was the only issue that the community cared about. They wanted a pool. Director doesn't want a pool. He set the tone within the first 15 minutes of the first meeting. And I just simply asked him, I go, then why am I here? And why are we going to have these meetings if we're going to end up with the same result? And, you know, and I think that was hard to say because you're challenging someone in authority. But I mean, if you're going to have a process and you're going to listen to it, but you want to end up with the same result, then one part of that sentence is lying, you know, and you have to tell me which one, and we could work on it. If you want me to walk into a meeting and we have to say, hey, there's no pool, let's design the space with no pool, that's ideal. Or if you want me to walk in, we could have that process and we know what challenges might come from that. Or if you want me to walk into a project that says we might consider a pool, but I already know the answer is no, I won't sign up for that. And if I'm not going to do that project, you don't have to pay me a cent, just pay my airfare for getting out here to tell you no. You know, and so I think that took a decade to feel comfortable saying that, because I would rather have the difficult conversations up front. And if you're not willing to have that, then I can't represent you and I can't represent the community, and I'm not willing to lie to people and get up there for it, because I don't think it's a fair process.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Gary, you had an answer to that question in the chat, but you said you wanted to speak to it.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute, just responding to Karen's last one. Oh boy, where do I start? So very frustrating, because we, even, you know, working for a lot of developers in the development industry, I totally agree with Catherine, because from a community perspective and from an industry perspective, when you're coming into a municipal setting and they say, yeah, well, we're opening to listening about this community plan, and they're not, you got to call them out on it. So there's a big plan here that was coming out for its third round of public consultation, second to last. And we were challenging them on certain parameters around design that just did not work. And when you get an answer, whether you're a developer or a community, of, yeah, but we're not going to change it. I heard what you said, but it's going to stay the way that it is. Oh, by the way, we're still open. We're all ears, we're in listening mode. Those kind of phrases that you hear, like there's times where you get frustrated and you just want to walk out. You have to call them out on it when you feel that there is a dishonest process. And I did. And I said, what's the point of you saying that this is public engagement? You should come in and say, this is our plan and we're presenting it to you. I'd be fine with that, because then I know that we intervene somewhere else. Just present it to us that way and be upfront about it. Don't tell us that you're engaging with us to take comments when it's just going to stay the way that it is. That's all it is. Just be upfront about it. And if they're not, from a community perspective and from a developer's perspective, that's where I think that they are very well aligned when you're dealing with municipality. Some do it well and will listen. Others like to dictate. And I find that the bigger municipalities like to dictate versus listen.
Thank you so much for that. We're coming down to the last minute or two, so I just wanted to end things on an optimistic note. After we have spoken to the challenges about working with larger municipalities. And this is also a question for Mercedes, who is joining us from Parkdale People's Economy, for those who joined us late. In just a few sentences, we would love to hear what keeps you going with the way you work, because the way you work is not the status quo. It's different. You push back, you do things differently, and what keeps you going? Is it client trends, shifting mindsets in the industry, and what inspires you to keep doing what you do?
Yeah, thank you so much, and grateful to everyone learning so much from this panel. Definitely the way that the Parkdale People's Economy operates is quite different in many ways from what we've been hearing today, because we support community planning, but we're rooted in community. The people we are ultimately accountable to are community members, and especially centering the voices of people who will be most impacted by potential development projects that may lead to displacement. So the planning process we've been leading right now has been a huge source of inspiration, and also really thinking about the ways that community, through organizing and collective planning processes, can become organized enough to bring forward collective visions and ideas of what could be possible in a planning or development context, and push for things that might not have seemed possible at the beginning of a project, and through enough kind of advocacy, be able to push for change. Some really great examples of this taking place in Parkdale are examples like a large-scale community hub that was being redeveloped, and based on the strong voice of the community really pushing for the possibility of affordable housing being on site, it led to the expropriation of a nearby building to then also be able to add on new supportive and cooperative housing potentials in that space. A lot of our work also centers not only housing advocates in the neighborhood, but also, as we said, the people most impacted by projects. So oftentimes when we work with tenants or former tenants of specific buildings that are in the midst of being potentially redeveloped, we come up with completely different sets of demands than we may have potentially started off with simply by creating frameworks for community benefits in the development in the neighborhood, for example. So yeah, really being able to engage with community and build those deep relationships and trusting relationships are at the core of what we do. And thanks to the support of groups like Co-Design Now and the work that you've all done, we've been able to build out new tools to be able to support that engagement in a different way. Yeah, so all of those are very inspiring. Thanks for having me.
But trust and talking to people. You've nailed it. What you've done, Mercedes, and with your group and your association is so unique, Canada-wide. So there's incredible success that you've had. I think you should be congratulated. It also sometimes, when you look at it, it's in some ways it's a shame when you're like, why am I advocating for stuff that is just common sense? So that's it. It's kind of how it is in like you're really bringing public engagement into the 21st century in Greater Toronto. So I'd like to congratulate you on that. Been observing it for the last decade with some frustration. So hats off, congrats. Good work.
Thanks for that. Catherine, Gary, did you have any last, what inspires you to keep going with your work?
I don't know, Mercedes.
Before we tie off.
Yeah, good projects that have great community buy-in, that are financially and socially successful, and that help people. I grew up in an immigrant family that was on the verge of social housing and, close to the poverty line. And I understand hardships that families go through. So when we've been able to advocate for projects that have some social purpose, and each of them has a varying degree, but I like the cumulative impact of each one if we can do a little bit. That's what keeps me going.
Yeah, I agree with Gary. And to add the as a much maligned millennial, it took me a while to have the patience to see these projects through, right? You have to realize that inequities in our cities were not built over days or years. I mean, it's generations. And so that's the timeline you have to think about undoing them and changing them. And I think that it feels immediacy is still even not fast enough, but just seeing some things through from a policy change, a departmental change, and a project change. I mean, planning projects, everything takes years. And so being ready to commit to years through our design practice, that I think is the motivating factor of now we're at a point where we're seeing success on projects that we've started. We're seeing success with communities we're working with and how they're transforming. And then we're having a peer group that now is seeing success on their projects also. So there's a shared strategy and platform that we now can tap into. Because I think when I was first starting the firm, a decade plus ago, there weren't a lot of places where I could ask these questions. And now more and more, we could have panels like this. We could have, community members we could reach out to, and leadership. We see more examples at a high level that we could bring to our own municipalities to say, like, here's a case study of how they did it. It's possible. Can we talk it through? And I think that's the success, that the motivating piece that I look forward to every day.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I think
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Gary, and Tavishka, Reina, and Mercedes. Did you have any last words, our moderators for today?
I think that's it from us. I just wanted to make a comment about when a recording will be available on the CSLA website.
We'll get on it as soon as we can. We'll send out a message. It usually doesn't take too long, but we'll get that loaded on our website along with all of our other webinars. And just on behalf of the CSLA, I really want to thank you for this presentation today and this discussion. I think, it shows some real hope and some resources and some great ideas all around. So again, I really want to thank you. Just let everybody know that this work will continue. The CSLA, along with all of the component associations and the LACF, is going to be releasing quite soon an action plan for the profession on justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. So we're really excited about this and the kinds of things that it's proposing to move the profession on this issue. So let's keep working on it. And again, to our three co-moderators and our two panelists, I really want to thank you for this presentation today. It was really interesting and we appreciate your time. Mm-hmm. And as Vishka mentioned, we're going to be posting this on the CSLA website. So we'll share that just as soon as it's ready. And I think we are done for today, unless Vishka, did you have anything else, or Reina, that you wanted to?
Yes, just one last thing. The results of our year-long research process, supported by Landscape Architecture Canada Foundation, is available on our website at www.commonspacecoalition.com. The report and website is there if you'd like to read what informed this discussion today.
Wonderful.
I just want to give a huge thanks to everyone for being here. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. The one good thing about virtual is I could travel to another country over lunch.
Welcome to Canada.
Yeah, thank you.
Merci tout le monde. Bon après-midi. Thanks everybody and have a great afternoon.
Thank you.